The canvas walls shook lightly in the morning wind, carrying the faint smell of antiseptic and burned metal through the wards. Medics moved with practiced precision, their voices low, their steps steady, as if the entire room depended on the calm rhythm they kept. Sunlight slipped through narrow seams in the tent, cutting pale lines across cots filled with wounded prisoners, who watched every movement with guarded eyes. At the far end of the room sat a young girl, thin and exhausted, her knees pulled tightly to her chest. She had been brought in only hours earlier, carried by 2 guards who barely understood why she trembled at every sound. Now she watched the nearest medic approach, his hands slow and open, his posture meant to reassure. But reassurance meant nothing to her. The moment his fingers lifted toward her arm, she recoiled with violent force, pressing herself against the cot's frame, as if the touch itself could shatter her. A sharp cry broke from her throat, not loud, but filled with a fear that froze the entire room. Instruments rattled. A clipboard slipped from someone's hand. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Every medic turned. Shock moved across their faces, not because she refused help, but because her reaction carried a depth of terror none of them had expected. She stared at them with wide, frantic eyes, her breath breaking into short, panicked bursts. The medic stepped back instantly, hands raised, stunned by how quickly a simple gesture had collapsed the calm of the ward. Whispers stirred among the other prisoners, but no answer surfaced. The girl kept shaking, clutching her sleeves, as though the fabric could shield her from the world. The question settled over the ward with a weight no one could ignore. Why couldn't she be touched? The ward settled into a heavy stillness after her outburst, as if every sound knew it should quiet itself. The medics stepped back in unspoken agreement, giving the girl space she hadn't asked for, but clearly needed. Their hands lowered, their posture softened, and each man watched her with the cautious attention reserved for someone standing on the edge of panic. No one moved closer. No one risked breaking her fragile grip on control. Across the row of cots, the other women whispered to one another, their voices barely threading through the tense air. They spoke quickly, warning each other with fragments of fears learned long before the war ended. Some believed the Americans punished those who resisted. Others feared humiliation if they revealed weakness. The stories varied, but the dread behind them remained the same. They had survived on these warnings, and letting go of them felt as dangerous as letting go of breath. The girl kept her eyes locked on the floor, her shoulders trembling beneath her thin clothes. She pulled her knees tighter, as if shrinking into herself could make her invisible. Shame flickered across her face, but it was swallowed by something deeper. Years of being told to expect cruelty from the very hands, now trying to help her. She could not separate the past from the present, not yet. The medics exchanged quiet glances, confusion tightening their expressions. They had seen fear before, but not this kind. Fear shaped into instinct, fear that rose at the slightest reach of a hand. Their concern grew, threaded with frustration they kept buried. They wanted to help her, but every attempt only deepened her terror. In that stillness, 2 worlds stood inches apart. One reached out with care, the other recoiled with memories neither side could see. He stood a few steps away from her cot, the noise of the ward fading as he focused on the girl who refused every hand offered to her. The lead medic had treated soldiers covered in burns, prisoners shaking from hunger, and men broken by the final days of combat. Yet something in her stillness held his attention in a different way. She sat curled against the canvas wall, breathing in short, uneven bursts, each breath sounding as if it might collapse into panic. He didn't move closer. Instead, he watched her the way one studies a fragile signal, trying to understand its pattern before attempting to reach it. Each time a medic shifted nearby, she flinched, sometimes only a twitch in her shoulders, sometimes a full tightening of her body as though preparing for a blow. Her eyes darted toward any motion, then dropped quickly, as if meeting a gaze might expose her to danger she had been taught to expect. He noticed how her hands never rested, fingers clenched, released, then curled again, as though she was bracing for something unseen. Even when no one approached, her breathing stayed shallow, caught between fear and exhaustion. These were not the reactions of someone resisting treatment. They were the reflexes of someone who had learned to survive by avoiding touch altogether. The medic felt a quiet tension rise in him. Duty told him to complete the examination, to push past her fear for the sake of her health. But compassion softened that urgency. He understood that forcing care on someone so frightened would break more than it healed. Still, stepping back felt wrong too. He was responsible for her well-being, yet every attempt to help her risked deepening the very harm she carried. He remained still, grounded by a humility that surprised him. This was not a moment for authority or confidence. It was a moment to listen without expectation, to observe without intrusion, and to accept that healing sometimes began long before any bandage touched skin. The whispers began in low, wavering tones, spreading through the women's ward like a quiet current. They did not speak loudly. Fear had taught them caution long before they entered this place. But as the medics stepped back and the room settled, memories surfaced. Memories shaped not by experience, but by warnings whispered in cellars and shelters during the final months of the war. The women recalled posters, stories, and overheard rumors that told them American hands harmed more than they healed. Some believed medics used treatments as punishment. Others believed that allowing a foreign soldier to touch an injury meant surrendering dignity itself. They shared fragments of these myths now, trading fear as if it were instruction. One woman murmured that Americans exposed prisoners' wounds to shame them. Another said she had heard that injured faces were used as examples, left uncovered for all to see. None of the stories matched, yet each carried the same dark spine. Contact meant vulnerability, and vulnerability meant danger. The girl who recoiled from the medic had lived inside these warnings longer than she could remember. Her reaction was not a moment of panic. It was the result of years spent expecting harm disguised as help. Any hand reaching toward her felt like a threat shaped in the shadows of propaganda, reinforced by every whisper she heard on the road to captivity. Touch had become a line she could not cross, a boundary she believed was necessary for survival. Across the room, the medics observed the subtle conversations, but understood none of the words. They saw only the tightened expressions and the guarding posture of women, who had been taught to fear them without ever knowing them. The gulf between them was wide, built not by violence here, but by warnings carried from a world that had never allowed trust to take root. The medics tried again later that afternoon, approaching with the same quiet restraint they used for the most fragile patients. They kept their hands low, their steps soft, and their voices steady, careful not to repeat the mistake that had shattered the room earlier. One of them lifted a stethoscope only halfway, showing her there would be no sudden move. Another crouched to lessen the height between them. Every gesture was meant to reassure, to say, without words, that she was safe. But the moment their attention gathered around her cot, her body folded inward. Her breathing, already thin, dropped into a tight, uneven rhythm. She pressed herself back until her spine touched the canvas wall, eyes fixed on the floor, as though looking up might break something inside her. When the nearest medic extended an arm no closer than a foot, she froze entirely. Not a sound, not a breath, only stillness so complete it felt like a plea. The other prisoners reacted before the medics could. They shifted closer, forming a loose wall around her, their shoulders angled as if shielding her from an invisible harm. None of them spoke, but their faces carried unmistakable warning. Don't push her. Don't touch her. Don't make this worse. They had lived long enough with fear to recognize its deepest form, and now they braced themselves as though preparing for a wound that did not come from injury. Tension rippled through the ward. The medics stepped back again, exchanging troubled glances. They could see her condition weakening, fatigue tightening her eyelids, tremors running along her arms, but she refused even the smallest gesture of help. Each attempt brought her nearer to collapse. Yet she pushed every offer away with the same terrified stillness. The challenge was no longer medical. It was human and far heavier than any bandage they might have applied. He returned to her cot with the same steady steps, but this time he stopped much farther away than before. The medic knew she watched every motion, every shift of weight, so he made his posture clear. Hands at his sides, shoulders lowered, no instruments in reach. He let the distance speak for him. No approach, no reach, only space. She lifted her head a fraction, startled not by closeness, but by the absence of it. For the first time since she had entered the ward, no one stood over her. No one waited for her to react. The air around her felt wider, less sharp, as if the walls of fear she had built were no longer pressed upon from all sides. Her breath, still fragile, eased just enough for her shoulders to lower by a thread. The medic remained still, grounding himself in patience. He shifted back a single step, slow, intentional, letting her see the choice rather than the movement. The gesture struck her more deeply than any attempt to comfort her had. She blinked, confusion and caution warring behind her eyes. Something inside her wavered, not breaking, but bending. Her fingers relaxed around the fabric of her sleeves. The tremor in her arms softened. She watched him with guarded curiosity, trying to understand why he held himself at such a careful distance. She had expected insistence, perhaps even force, but instead she saw restraint, a kind of respect she had not known could exist in places built from surrender. Her breathing grew steadier, though faint and uneven. She lifted her head another inch, enough for the medic to see the outline of her cheek beneath the shadows. He didn't move. He didn't try to close the gap. He simply let the moment settle. Then, almost accidentally, her eyes met his. It lasted only a heartbeat, a fragile brush of connection before she looked away again. But the silence around them shifted, carrying the first small break in the defenses that had held her captive long before she entered this room. She shifted slightly on the cot, adjusting the scarf she kept wrapped around her shoulders. The movement was small, no more than a tired attempt to get comfortable, but the fabric slipped just enough for a patch of skin to catch the pale light coming through the canvas seam. The medic noticed it before she realized anything had changed. A faint glimpse of an old wound, softened by time but still marked by fire and collapse. It appeared only for a moment, a curve of injured skin, just visible beneath the cloth, but it told a story far heavier than her silence ever could. He did not let his expression change. Years of training steadied his breath, but the sight touched something deeper than professional instinct. He looked away briefly, not out of discomfort, but to give her the dignity of not being studied. When he turned back, his face held only calm, as though he had seen nothing at all. The scarf slid back into place as she pulled it up quickly, unaware of how much she had revealed. Her hands trembled, tightening around the fabric as if afraid the world had witnessed too much. Inside him, conflict tightened. He wanted to reach out, not to examine the injury, but to offer even a fraction of comfort. Yet he knew that any movement risked destroying the fragile trust forming between them. The restraint required felt heavier than any medical decision he had made. Her wounds were not just on her skin. They were woven into her reactions, her silence, her desperate need to shield herself from touch. He stepped back half a pace, letting the space settle again. She noticed, her breathing easing slightly as the distance returned. He understood then that healing her meant learning when not to move, when not to speak, when not to see more than she was ready to show. In that moment, empathy became his quiet burden, one he carried without a single word. He returned the next morning with a folded piece of clean cloth held carefully in his hands. It was simple, soft, unused, meant for bandaging, but he carried it as though it were something far more personal. His steps were slow, measured, each one taken with the same quiet respect he had shown since her first outburst. The ward was calm at this hour, the low hum of activity muted beneath the canvas roof, giving the moment a stillness that felt almost intentional. When he reached her cot, he did not move closer than the distance she had already learned to accept. He stopped there, steady and patient, letting her see that he came with nothing that could harm her. Her eyes lifted faintly, uncertain, already tightening with the instinct to recoil. He held the cloth where she could see it clearly, but did not extend his arm fully. The offer remained suspended in the space between them, gentle and unobtrusive. She froze. Confusion crossed her face, first, a flicker of disbelief that softened the tension in her shoulders. No one had offered her anything before. Not without demand, not without consequence. She watched him carefully, waiting for the command that usually followed such gestures, waiting for the insistence she had come to expect from every authority she had known. But He said nothing. He only waited. The silence stretched, soft but heavy, until the meaning of the gesture began to reach her. Her hands trembled as she loosened her grip on her scarf. Slowly, hesitantly, she reached forward. Her fingers brushed the cloth as though expecting it to be taken away. When it remained hers, she closed her hand around it, pulling it to her chest with a quiet, startled breath. He stepped back at once, giving her room to breathe. She didn't look up again, but the way she held the cloth, carefully, protectively, carried something new. Not trust, not yet, but the first faint thread of connection, shaped not by words or touch, but by humility offered at exactly the distance she needed. The ward was unusually quiet that afternoon, not with fear, but with a careful kind of waiting. The girl sat upright on her cot, the clean cloth folded neatly in her hands. She touched its edges as though grounding herself, tracing the fabric with a slow, uncertain calm. The medics worked at a distance, their movements gentle, their voices softened to match the new rhythm settling through the room. Nothing had been asked of her since morning. No examination, no approach. Only space. She lifted her gaze for a moment, noticing the medic who had offered the cloth, moving along his usual path between the cots. He did not look toward her, yet his steady presence felt close enough to steady her own breath. Something in the room shifted then, a quiet recognition that she held the choice now. Not them. Her fingers tightened around the cloth. The words formed before she fully decided to release them, rising from a place long locked behind silence. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely more than a thread. "Thank you." It was almost lost beneath the rustle of canvas, almost swallowed by her own trembling breath. But the medic heard it. He paused only slightly, a subtle acknowledgment, careful not to turn and overwhelm the fragile moment with attention. He continued his work with the same deliberate calm, letting her dignity remain untouched. The women around her felt the change instantly. They exchanged glances, first cautious, then curious. One leaned closer to a neighbor and murmured something soft. Another answered. The whispers did not carry fear this time, they carried possibility, the smallest spark of connection returning to a place that had forgotten the sound of shared voices. Across the ward, the medics watched without interfering. They understood that something important had shifted, something no treatment had managed to reach. A single word, spoken quietly, had opened a door none of them could have forced. Hope, fragile and new, had finally entered the room. She sat with the cloth resting in her lap, its clean folds giving her courage she had not expected to find. The ward was quieter than usual, the medics working in soft rhythms that did not press against her thoughts. She waited until the medic who had shown her patience walked past and paused at a respectful distance. He did not ask for anything. He simply stood still, offering the space she needed to begin. Her voice, when it came, carried the weight of someone speaking through layers of memory. She explained that the injuries beneath her scarf were remnants of a night when fire swept through her street and the world collapsed before she could escape. A wall had fallen beside her, trapping her in heat and smoke until others pulled her free. The burns were not the worst of it. It was the way people looked at afterward. Quick glances that turned into avoidance, expressions that shifted from concern to discomfort. She learned to cover her face, not because anyone demanded it, but because covering it spared her from seeing what she caused in others. She kept her eyes low as she spoke of the fear that followed her into captivity. She believed any sign of injury would mark her as weak, that her face would become something to judge or pity. Touch, even gentle touch, felt like exposure. It threatened to reveal the person she no longer recognized. The war had taken her home, her safety, and finally the version of herself she once understood. What remained felt fragile, easily broken by a careless glance or hand reaching too quickly. The medic listened without moving, his silence steady and without expectation. She drew a slow breath, the first that did not tremble. For the first time, her story belonged not to fear, but to truth. The ward moved with a gentler rhythm in the days that followed, as if the tension that once gripped every corner had finally loosened. The women still carried the weight of the warnings they had been taught, but the certainty behind those fears had begun to fade. The girl's small acts of trust, her whispered gratitude, her willingness to uncover a piece of her past, had shifted something larger than her own story. It touched everyone who witnessed it. The medic reflected on how deeply the myths had shaped them. They had been taught to expect cruelty in every gesture, danger in every hand, humiliation in every moment of weakness. These beliefs had become part of their identity, guiding their reactions long after surrender. Yet, a single act of humility, a clean cloth offered without demand, had begun to undo what years of fear had built. Kindness had reached a place where orders and explanations never could. He watched the cook ladle warm broth into bowls, the steam curling into the cool air. Even food seemed to carry meaning now. It was no longer just sustenance, it was a signal of safety, a quiet assurance that not every hand reaching toward them was meant to take something away. Small routines, careful steps, shared glances, quiet service became threads of healing, binding the ward in ways none of them had expected. The girl sat among the others with her scarf resting gently around her shoulders. She held the cloth he had given her not as a shield, but as a reminder of the moment when fear stopped guiding every breath. Her presence no longer drew whispers of warning, it drew a quiet respect, a recognition that truth had begun to replace the stories they once believed. War had taught them to brace for harm. It had never taught them how to recognize compassion when it appeared, softly, without demand, offering space instead of control. Here, in this fragile calm, they were learning it together. The cloth rested lightly across her hands as she sat near the open flap of the ward, where a thin line of spring air drifted through the canvas. She no longer held it with the guarded grip of someone protecting herself. Instead, she touched it gently, the way one holds an object tied to a moment that changed more than it appeared to. The simple band of fabric had become a symbol of quiet healing, a reminder of the first gesture that reached her without force, expectation, or fear. Around her, the ward carried a different tone now. The women spoke in soft exchanges, their voices no longer shaped by the tight edge of suspicion. The medics moved with the same discipline as before, yet their presence no longer brought tension. A sense of calm had settled between both sides, built not from victory or surrender, but from the slow, human work of understanding. Moments like this rarely reached the pages of official records. They lived in the margins of war, in the brief spaces where compassion interrupted the long shadow of conflict. Across Europe, similar stories unfolded, small acts of care between strangers, quiet efforts by medics, cooks, and guards who chose kindness when the world had given them every excuse to turn away. These were not grand events, yet they shaped the recovery that followed the fighting, stitching together the fragile beginnings of peace. The girl lifted the cloth once more, letting it fall gently across her lap. She breathed without flinching, her shoulders no longer braced for harm. The war had divided nations, families, and identities, leaving scars far deeper than the ones she carried on her skin. But here, in this simple moment, it was clear that humanity still had the power to mend what violence had broken. Healing had begun not with medicine, but with a single act of quiet mercy, one that would echo long after the tents came down and the world moved forward.